Hello, I'm David Legge. In this presentation, I'll be talking about global health, global governance, globalisation, and related matters. There's actually a lot more in the presentation than I'll be able to speak to, but there are notes pages on the slides that I'm using, and they'll be available via a PDF. And I'll give you the URL for that PDF at the end of the presentation. Even there's going to be more that I'll be covering, and in some respects I'll just be touching on ideas or names or events which all call for further investigation. So in a sense, this presentation is not the end but the beginning of an exploration of some of the issues regarding global health governance. I hope it's useful for you. I shall start by reviewing the outstanding features of global health today, both the living conditions which create health and determine healthcare provision. I'll then explore the different meanings of this term globalisation and explore the concept of global governance and global health governance. The main focus of the presentation, however, is an historical review of some of the main events in global health policy over the last 50 to 60 years, contextualised in relation to contemporary movements in the global economy and in geopolitics. I'll end with some reflections on how public health practitioners and health activists generally might work towards a more equitable, sustainable, and healthy global dispensation. If we want to think about global health challenges, we can divide them into health systems and challenges regarding the social determination of health. And of course, the largest issue under health systems is lack of resources, and the most current sensitive issue under that is probably workforce and price of medicines. But there are other issues affecting health systems, including widening inequalities and loss of social solidarity. And of course, the wider the inequality, the more stressed is this idea of social solidarity and willingness to pool. We're also facing pressures to privatise and stratify health systems, good for the rich, middle for the middle, and minimal for the poor. And a big issue then is brain drain, which I'll come back to, and the fragmentation of health systems through vertical donor-supported disease programs. In relation to the social determination of health, we've listed on the slide some fairly obvious, huge factors which shape health: unemployment, marginalisation, poverty, rapid urbanisation without adequate infrastructure, the marketing of unhealthy products and behaviours, insecurity, conflict and violence, and of course, environmental degradation. These are all major global health challenges, and any progress in terms of global health governance needs to be measured against these. Which brings me to the idea of globalisation. And on this slide, I've listed three different usages of the term globalisation. The first of these is the most concrete: globalisation as a global village, bringing people closer together through communications and transport. The main health implications of globalisation as a global village are issues like communicable disease and the illicit drug trade, food and alcohol, fashions and health policy, and so forth. The next heading is about globalisation as global economic integration, and globalisation is sometimes spoken of in these terms. And this refers to global markets, the fact that the marketplace reflects materials which are sourced globally, that the production, the sourcing, the production and the marketing are carried by so-called global supply chains. And a critical feature of this is the increasing size, role, and global reach of transnational corporations. An increasing proportion of international trade is in fact conducted within these corporations, and the corporations make choices with regard to production sites, sourcing of global materials, and so forth. Investment decisions likewise are increasingly global, and the transnational corporations, as a consequence of these changes, are exercising increasing power vis-a-vis the nation state. So, but in association with the increasing power of the transnational corporations or industrial corporations is the increasing size and power and global integration of the financial sector. And over the last 30 years, there's been a dramatic increase in the flow of resources into speculation and financial gambling, and the increasing role of debt in supporting consumption. Okay, so that's globalization as global economic integration. Let's look at globalization as a regime of economic and political governance. This is another use of the term globalization. And if we think about the governance of this global regime, we can think about the 6 kind of pillars of governance that I've listed on this slide. The formal regulatory structures, including multilateral institutions and agreements, the empires, the big powers, and the nation states, and the interplay of nation states. A series of institutions which mediate what I'm calling market discipline, and I'll come back to that. The transnational corporations, which I've mentioned already, and their peak bodies. And then there's an old-fashioned category here called classes, constituencies and social movements, and I'll explore this. And finally, there are the institutions which mediate the creation and flow of information, knowledge, and ideology. Before I get to these different pillars of global governance, let's just look at the idea of governance. What is the significance of the movement from a discourse of government to a discourse of governance? Well, historically, once upon a time, we talked about tribalism, about feudalism and warlordism. I'm sorry, we didn't talk about them. Let's start that again. What's the significance of this move in the discourse from government to governance? Well, in early days, government didn't exist, essentially, and the governance of human populations was structured around the dynamics of tribalism, feudalism, and warlordism. The early development of the nation state under kings and emperors and popes was characterized by a form of government and governance undertaken by divine right. In the modern state, we have a system, generally speaking, of representative government and electoral democracy. And this is the structure of government. But when we move beyond the state to the level of the globe, there is no government to speak of. Historically, the governance of global interchange has been through war, negotiations and treaties, but in the modern period we are seeing increasing numbers of intergovernmental organisations as well as the older forms of war, negotiation and governance. This idea of governance Governance is the domain of deliberate human agency. It's how we collectively choose to respond to the degradation of the human environment, widening inequality globally, lack of access to decent healthcare, lack of access to the economic, cultural and social conditions for healthy living. So if that is governance, what is global health governance? It's those domains of decision making which shape the health opportunities of people but lie beyond the autonomous control of the nation state. Now, the most obvious instance of this is with respect to international cooperation around the control of communicable disease. But it also touches upon the global economic decision making, which shapes the health opportunities, including the resources for healthcare of countries, of peoples. And it also includes international aid giving, which is notionally directed towards health and to development. Okay, so let's return to the 6 pillars of global governance and look about how they operate in relation particularly to health. First of all, the first pillar is of the formal regulatory structures, the multilateral institutions and agreements. And on this slide, we've listed the Bretton Woods institutions. Bretton Woods is a town in New Hampshire in the US where there was an important conference in 1944 at which the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, was established and the World Bank was established, and there was a discussion about an international trade organization. But it was not until 1994, 50 years later, that an agreement was signed to establish what then became the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So the Bretton Woods institutions are paradigm cases for this idea of multilateral institutions as formal regulatory structures. Of course, the UN system is equally important, and that in terms of health will include the Economic and Social Council of the General Assembly, the UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme. It'll include WHO, UNAIDS, UNICEF, the United Nations High Commission on Human Rights, and of course the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And there's a lot more to the UN system. The third major group are these things called public-private partnerships in health, which have really sprung up over the last 15 years. And I've listed 4 on this slide, representing 4 involvements in different areas. The Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria is a public-private partnership, which, as I say, fights those conditions. The Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunisation, or the Gavi Alliance, was sponsored initially by the Gates Foundation and works on vaccines and immunisation. Scaling Up Nutrition, SUN, is a public-private partnership which worries about nutrition, although why it worries about it is another matter. And the International Health Partnership Plus, IHP Plus, is a public-private partnership which worries about health systems. The final category on this slide are a wide range of different conventions and agreements. These other bodies have some form of secretariat. These others are, broadly speaking, agreements about how nation states will operate, and that includes all the WTO agreements, which I discuss separately in a presentation on trade. It includes the various declarations on economic, political, cultural and social rights, the Kyoto Agreement on climate change, the international health regulations and the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So this is the first pillar of global health governance, the formal regulatory structures. The second pillar and probably the first in terms of importance, are the empires, the big powers, and the various groupings of nation states. And on this slide, I've listed 4 ways in which these big powers operate. First of all, their role in governing the regulatory structures, which I've spoken about under the first pillar. And so if we look at the WTO negotiations, which are dominated by the US, Europe, and Japan, we look at the Basel Conventions, which deal with banking, dominated by Europe and the US and Japan. We can look at the UN, WIPO, the World Health Assembly, all of which are fora for negotiation and debate and conflict, where the big powers and other nation states play a critical role. And then, of course, the regional free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties are also part of the regulatory framework, which are determined by the big powers. Occasionally, the big powers need to resort to direct disciplinary action, either through trade sanctions or covert destabilization, the US in Central America is the case in point, or armed intervention, of which we've had quite a lot in the last 20 years. Then there's official development assistance, which is clearly part of the governance picture, and where the nation states play a key role. And I've listed, for example, AusAid, which has now been rolled into DFAT, USAID and PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, and DFID, the UK Department for International Development. And then finally, I've listed some key structures which belong to this broad category of empires, big powers, and nation states, including the G8, the OECD, the EU, the US. But on the other hand, representing the South is the G77 and the South Centre, and a number of other groupings of nation states who, coming together, exercise additional influence on the way the system works. The third pillar is the private sector and the transnational corporations. Transnational corporations have, over the last 50 years, grown in size, increasing number. They are transnational in their practice, but generally have domestic roots. But if it's convenient, they're always capable of tearing up those roots and rooting themselves elsewhere. It's important to distinguish the industrial corporations from financial corporations, such as the banks. Not that they're different in their beneficence, but they play a different role in the global economic relations. Transnational corporations carry an increasing proportion of global trade. They play a dominant role in mobilizing funds and technologies for investment. In terms of this so-called global value chains, the intra-firm trade gives corporations wide scope for transfer pricing and avoiding tax, or underestimating invoices or overestimating invoices in order to transfer capital between countries. So this gives them a lot of financial power. And of course, they have political leverage from their ability to auction investment and employment benefits, as well as direct bribes and political contributions. The private sector is also represented on this slide by a range of philanthropies, and I've listed some of the major philanthropies globally impacting on health. Of course, all of them are US, and many of them you will be very familiar with. I've also listed policy think tanks which belong to the private sector, and the three I've listed, for example, are the International Health Metrics and Evaluation Group, the Results for Development Group, and one of the largest subcontractors of USAID is ABT Associates. And all of these bodies, as well as being contractors and undertaking various forms of development assistance and projects, they also publish influential reports. In terms of fora, where the private sector meets, the World Economic Forum is, of course, the preeminent forum globally, but excuse me, there's also industry associations such as the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations, and various industry-specific projects such as the International Trademark Association, which I've listed just for example. Excuse me. My fifth subgroup under this private sector group are the development assistance contractors. So I'm making the point that there is a large industrial section involved in receiving official development money to deliver development projects, and I've cited the IDC of Australia as the trade group of this body in Australia. In my final dot point on this slide, I have listed some cases which I'm not really in a position to go into except to comment on Nestle and its role in relation to the marketing of breast milk substitutes. NCDs and Pepsi. Pepsi has been a powerful voice in relation to NCDs, desperately seeking to protect the sugar content of its product. Big Pharma and its role in promoting the continuous enforcement of easier and easier intellectual property rights, and so forth and so on. A key feature of globalisation in the present period is the power over the nation state, which is exercised through various private markets, including the share market, the bond market, the currency market, the futures markets, and the proliferating markets in derivatives. This is a way in which the dispersed interests of richer people who speculate and engage in these markets is able to influence what the nation state is able to do. Let's say a government chooses to nationalise an oil company with limited compensation. This will elicit a fall in the price of shares of companies based in that country, which will mean a loss of value for local shareholders and foreign shareholders for that matter, and political outrage at their wealth having been reduced. It'll produce a steep increase in the cost of borrowing for governments as the banks, the foreign banks, the global banks, demand a higher interest rate for lending money to a country which has done such a dastardly thing as to nationalise an oil company. And that will therefore flow on to increases in local interest rates, which will mean that people who have debts will start to be very politically distressed about those debts. And there will be a fall in the foreign purchases of the local currency. So, in other words, corporations in other countries who might otherwise need to buy your currency in order to buy your product and take it to their country will be less interested, which means that the price of your currency will fall, which will mean that the price of imported goods will rise. So let's just stay with those three mechanisms: that the share owners will be angry because they've lost wealth, the borrowers in your country will be angry because they face increasing interest rates, and the ordinary shoppers will be angry because they face increasing prices with respect to imported goods. So the political implications of the marketplace in expressed through these kind of mechanisms is very significant. It is, in a sense, dispersed, in a sense, anonymous, but in another sense, it's a manifestation of the interests of the wealthier classes of people who own shares, who want to buy foreign products, who and so on, and who maybe have got heavy borrowings. It's an aggregate expression of their interests, and in a sense, in that way, it is an expression of class interest. While the political power of this market sentiment is manifest through multiple anonymous investors, it's mediated through the traders who trade in currency, shares and derivatives, the financial media, the ratings agencies and various legal and accounting bodies. And in a sense, the interests which these various choices express are, as I say, interests of the capitalist class. Which brings us to the fourth, I think, pillar in respect of this idea of the pillars of global governance, which is the domain of classes, of different constituencies and of social movements. It's much more diffused. It's a much more diffused source of power, but still very influential. And it's shaped by commonalities with respect to identity, with respect to alliances, solidarities, commonalities of identity around nationality, ethnicity, caste, class, religion, language, and so forth. In the context of this presentation, I would emphasize 4 features through which this new this pillar of global governance operates. Firstly, there is an emergent global class structure, which is characterized by several layers. At the top is a reasonably coherent transnational capitalist class. There is a global middle class below that, which is dispersed, but still has a certain coherence to it and a certain self-consciousness of itself as having shared global values. There is a much more dispersed and divided working class, and at the bottom of the heap is a very large, excluded and marginalized section, which is, generally speaking, lacks any sense of global solidarity, which is unaware of the degree to which the oppressive features which you experience are shared by others. And many of the features of global governance can be understood in terms of the dynamics across these different classes. That's not the only way of cutting this particular cake, though. And more publicly, we've been discussing in the media the rise of fundamentalisms. And it's easy to focus on Islamic fundamentalism because that's what the media focuses on. But Islamic fundamentalism is not the only fundamentalism. There are other religious fundamentalisms, the Christians, the Jews, and perhaps even the Hindus. But perhaps more important is the market fundamentalists who have completely given up on the promises of consensus decision making, of government as a mediator of collective opinion and collective wishes, and have resorted to the blind faith in the beneficence of market relations or the blind faith in the beneficence of some sort of God. Okay, so on a more positive note, we could also include in this group the social movements, environmental movement, the women's movement, the labour movement, and various new movements, including movements around health. And separately considered, I think, are the various political movements, and I've given illustrations, the neoliberals, the anarchists, the social democrats, and so forth. In other words, the feature of the social movements tends to be an issue concentration or a particular population focus, whereas the political movements are focused more on some kind of relatively coherent political program, which allegedly will address the various issues which are being highlighted by the different social movements. Okay. Still on this pillar of classes, constituencies, is a more concrete expression of civil society are these various organisations through which civil society is organised. And these include professional associations, and I've listed the World Federation of Public Health Associations, the World Medical Association, the International Union of Health Promotion, Health Education. It includes the service delivery NGOs such as Oxfam, MSF, solidarity organisations structured around the particular needs of farm workers, as in the case of Via Campesina, fisherfolk, women, the faith-based organisations such as the World Council of Churches and the Vatican. I've highlighted an organisation which is no longer as active as it used to be, the Christian Medical Commission, but it's worth highlighting because of its role in at an earlier time in global governance. And then there are various issue-oriented activist organisations such as IBFAN, the International Baby Food Action Network, People's Health Movement, Corporate Accountability International, Knowledge Ecology Online, and the Third World Network. And these are all organisations which would be very interesting for you to follow up. Finally, the last pillar is the pillar of information, knowledge, and ideology, and the various institutions which support the generation and communication of information and ideas. It's useful to highlight the global power of information, as in the global power of health statistics. When people realize just how many women, young women, are dying in childbirth each year, around 300,000 per year across the globe. This is a very powerful statistic. So under this heading, I'm talking about the power of such statistics. It also includes research and analysis, and I've listed DALYs, the Disability Adjusted Life Years, as being an illustration of one form of analysis of these global health statistics. It includes the product development, includes policy ideas such as comprehensive primary health care, policy ideas such as cost effectiveness, and includes ideologies such as neoliberalism, various fundamentalisms, and the so-called Washington Consensus. Then in the second dot point on this slide, I've listed the information organisations, the organisations which support this economy of ideas. And these include academic and research centres such as Harvard, the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, Johns Hopkins, the EU Observatory. It includes the private sector, the R&D conducted through the private sector, but also includes policy analysis undertaken through the private sector. And I've mentioned Pfizer here specifically as a corporation which has for many years been very active in leading the pharmaceutical industry in its policy related engagements. Under the heading of information organisations, the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development, is an illustration of a forum, allegedly simply a discussion forum, which has been very powerful in relation to, in this case, in relation to development assistance. And then there are the media organisations, and these include, of course, Murdoch and the News Limited. They also include the more specific organisations such as Lancet, the BMJ, and Elsevier, the publishers. Listing media separately, I've listed under that the different kinds of media, including journals, lists, social media, etc. And the cases which I've cited to illustrate the power of information and ideas. First of all, the role of the World Bank in promoting cost-effective packages of health interventions. Secondly, the role of the mainstream journalists, the mainstream media, in promoting neoliberalism, and TINA, that stands for There Is No Alternative, which is attributed to Margaret Thatcher. There is no alternative, or TINA. In other words, there is no alternative to neoliberalism. And the role of NGO websites in informing campaigns against Big Pharma. These are examples of the institutions which are engaged in information, the economy of information and ideas. On this slide, I've highlighted a number of individuals, all of whom are Americans, most of whom are men. And I've highlighted them with a view to thinking about the careers of individual professionals whose careers knit together these different structures. People who move between one influential organization to the next, people whose life career, in a sense, illustrates a lot of the historical dynamics and the political dynamics that we're talking about here. Okay, so let's move from the structures and pillars of global governance to global health governance. And we need to talk a little bit about the use of language under this heading. Global health governance is sometimes divided into global health care governance, global health governance meaning the governance of the health care system, like the price of medicines, for example, versus global governance for health, which is about the governance of the social conditions which shape population health. And the example here would be the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. This distinction is not one that I find very useful, but it's important to be aware of it. In terms of health, there's a polarity between identifying health as a relatively autonomous domain of governance versus recognizing health as a subdomain of the broader issue, the broader framework of global economic and political governance. So if you see health as a semi-autonomous domain of governance, then you might use this framework for thinking about health security, the transmission of communicable disease across borders, and the role of, let's say, the international health regulations as a tool for containing the transmission of disease across borders. Or alternatively, the need for coordination of development assistance for health, and the need for more effective coordination of the World Bank, the global health initiatives, big pharma, the private donors, the bilateral donors, etc. So these might be examples of of global health governance being understood as being a relatively autonomous domain of governance. But the point I'm wanting to make, I guess, is that in my view, health needs to be understood as a subdomain of global economic and political governance. Whether you're talking about health security or international or development assistance for health, or whether you're talking about the role of the IMF in structural adjustment for debt relief or for currency crises, whether you're talking about the role of the World Trade Organization and bilateral regional trade agreements in shaping the structural determinants of health, such as the debates presently going on around plain packaging of tobacco products, or whether you're talking about the role of development assistance for health in promoting the corporate interests. So what I would wish to leave this slide, the text, the message from this slide, is to emphasize global health governance as a subdomain of global economic governance. So I'm wanting to explore the links between globalization and global health and the wider global economy. And what I'm proposing to do in the next few slides is to review some key episodes in global health policy since World War II against the changing dynamics of the global economy and the contemporary movements in the sphere of global economic regulation and global health governance. Now, this slide you shouldn't be too intimidated by, but because I've broken it up in the next few slides. But I want to highlight the fact that I've identified a series of events and episodes, phases, reports and struggles listed in chronological order and coloured according to whether they deal with the wider global health issues or wider economic and political issues. And in green, I've put health issues, and in red, I've put geopolitical and geoeconomic issues. My criteria for including different topics on this list was simply that they illustrate in an indicative way the broad trends which were taking place. This slide contains really quite a lot, so let's take it slowly. 1944, the Bretton Woods institutions were established, the IMF and the World Bank. The proposal for an international trade organization was not agreed to at that time, and it was not until 1994, 50 years later, that the WTO was formed. Now, the significance of these two Bretton Woods institutions in terms of the story we're telling today is the degree to which they lost their original functions. The IMF was originally designed to even out currency fluctuations associated with lags and advances in relation to trading revenues, so that if one country sold stuff and 6 months later they bought stuff, the IMF would help to even out the currency fluctuations. In fact, this turned out to be done more regularly, more evenly by the private banks, and by the 1980s, the IMF, the reason for the IMF's original establishment was no longer all that pressing. However, with the increasing financial pressures on developing countries in particular after the debt crisis, the IMF came into its own as the global policeman of neoliberal fiscal rectitude. And we'll come back to that repeatedly, particularly when we come to discuss the debt crisis. The World Bank is a little bit the same. The World Bank was established to provide large development finance for large infrastructure projects, and over the next 30 years, this is a function which was gradually moved to the private banks and private financiers. And by the 1980s, 90s, the World Bank had reinvented itself as the international agency for obliterating poverty. That's in quotes. Okay, so we'll come back to those two institutions, but it's important to keep in mind the changing functions of these two bodies. In green, let's take health development policy. The WHO in its first 10, 15, 25 years was in fact prevented from focusing at all on health systems. This is a period when international policy discourse around the developing countries and health was about DDT to control, in fact, to eliminate, it was the initial ambition, to eliminate malaria, and population control, of course, as well. The newly independent countries had inherited systems which neglected the rural poor, focused on the urban elite, and in the new independent period, there was also a new focus on indigenous medical education, but often following the older model from the West of teaching hospitals and 5-year medical degrees and so forth. This may not have been the best policy option at that time. This is the period of decolonisation, and in 1955, the Bandung Conference, of which gave birth to the non-aligned movement, signalled the emergence of a more confident third world voice, distinguishing itself in the context of the Cold War from both the USSR and its empire and the US and Europe and their empire. So the idea of a non-aligned movement carried a lot of confidence, which was then expressed quite clearly in the outcomes of the first UNCTAD conference in 1964, which saw the formation of the Group of 77 in the UN, a Group of 77 non-aligned third world countries in the UN, and the call for a new international economic order in May 1974. This new international economic order is very significant for us because it appears as part of the claim in the Alma-Ata Declaration regarding a new dispensation in the global economic governance. Basically, what the NIEO was calling for was space for sovereign countries to develop their own industry, differential treatment for developing countries in the trading regime, and other provisions which in essence run completely counter to today's neoliberal regime, today's Washington Consensus. Okay, which brings us to 1973 and the first OPEC price rise. What we now know is that the OPEC price rise signified the setting of the debt trap, but because the oil company, the Organisation of Petroleum Exporting Countries, identified that with increasing inflation, which was evident from the late 1960s through to early 1970s, increasing inflation was eating away at their revenues. And in addition to that, there were geopolitical reasons at the time for increasing the price of oil. The increase in the price of oil meant that the OPEC countries were flush with cash, but didn't have a great deal to spend it on. And so they put it in the bank, which meant that the US and European banks, where the OPEC countries stashed their cash, went circling around the globe trying to lend this money, because money which is sitting in the bank is of no use to the bank. So what happened was that this is a period where inflation's rising and there's a lot of money to be lent, which meant that the interest rates were relatively low. In fact, the interest rates were below the rate of inflation, which meant the bank salespersons were selling loans at negative interest rates. They were paying people to take these loans. In Africa, they were lending to governments. And in Asia, lending to governments. In Latin America, they were lending to corporations, but the loans were guaranteed by government, which meant that when the debt crisis hit, the government still had to pick up the pieces. So let's now look at the emergence of this optimism that I spoke about before in terms of the third world. It's the 1977 sees the last case of smallpox, and this is a cause for optimism. And in 1978, the Alma-Ata Declaration. We'll come back to the Alma-Ata Declaration in my presentation around health systems strengthening. But at this point, we'll note that it includes this reference to the new international economic order, that it is based on a model of healthcare which was, in a sense, indigenous to the developing countries. For reasons which we'll go into in more detail in this other presentation, the three countries which inspired Alma-Ata were in particular Indonesia, India in the JAMCED model, and Guatemala, the role of health promotores in Central America. However, the paradox is that 1978, the year of Alma-Ata, was also the year when, at the middle of the onset of stagflation, that the rich country economies were facing stagnation and inflation. It was the end of the long boom. And ultimately, in 1981, the governing bodies, in particular Thatcher and Reagan, decided that the best way to solve the problem of stagflation was essentially to force down wages, and to do that they needed to destroy the unions. To destroy the unions, they deliberately created a further recession through escalating interest rates. So there was the slogan, "Fight inflation first," which somehow said that by increasing interest rates we would fight inflation, knowing full well that increasing interest rates was going to slow the economy quite rapidly. However, there's now quite good evidence that it was, in fact, a strategy of attacking the unions and the employees. Okay, so this is the point where the debt trap is sprung, where because a whole lot of money has been lent to third world countries from 1973 onwards, but in 1981 the interest rates start going up and up and up to around 20% in 1981, which meant that as these loans rolled over, the borrowers found themselves facing interest rates of whatever 15%, which meant that they suddenly were finding that their loan obligations were escalating as fast as the interest rates. So it's not surprising that just 3 years after 1978, we saw an alternative policy to primary healthcare being offered, which was so-called selective primary healthcare, which was based on GOBI, the GOBI, growth monitoring, oral rehydration, breastfeeding, and immunisation. And under the guise of the UNICEF's child survival revolution, selective primary healthcare became the slogan which was being pushed in the direction of third world countries. By the mid-1980s, the debt crisis is in full swing. The IMF has been mobilised to lend as the lender of last resort to indebted countries, but impose strict conditions under this concept of structural adjustment plans, which imposed economic conditions on countries, which included reduced public spending, reduced spending on health systems, reduced spending on education, reduced food subsidies or no food subsidies. It included orienting the economy of the country to export through the use of devaluation. So the currency was devalued so that your exports became cheaper. Of course, everybody's being given this same advice, so everybody's exports are becoming cheaper, so they're competing still, and that means that your imported foodstuffs, your imported manufactured goods are becoming more expensive. This is a period of disinvestment in health systems, of destruction of health systems, and of increasing burden of disease. And at the same time as the structural adjustment was hitting, we got the rise of HIV from the mid to and late 1980s. At the same time as this period that we're talking about, the debt crisis is hit and HIV is hit. We've got the commencement of the Uruguay round, which was the Uruguay round of negotiations, which was to lead to the World Trade Organization in 1994. 1987, we see gradual a rising resistance to the brutality of the IMF's structural adjustment programs. With this publication through UNICEF in 1987 called Adjustment with a Human Face, and there was a comparable WHO document produced several years later called Health Dimensions of Economic Reform, both of which are essentially criticising the damage which is being done to public health through the structural adjustment programs. Okay, so that's the period 44 to 85. Let's move on. And to this period, from 1985 through to 2000, and of course 1989 is marked by the breakup of the Soviet Union, and that has other implications which we'll come to in due course. 1991, I've put in here the first, not the first, but one of the various attacks on the Thai pharmaceutical policies by the US Trade Representative. The US Trade Act has got this provision, Section 301, which enables the pharmaceutical companies and other companies to complain about other countries which are adopting policies which are seen to be hostile to American corporate interests. And that gives the US Trade Representative the right to impose sanctions. And so this is, I'm putting it here, not because it stands out as a particular issue, but it signifies this continuing pressure on the countries on developing countries to adopt pharmaceutical policies which are seen as compatible with the interests of big pharma. As I said, 1992, WHO issues its own gentle remonstrance of the IMF and its structural adjustment program. And 1993, perhaps because of this attack on the IMF, the World Bank produces the first World Development Report on health, which is called Investing in Health. Now, Investing in Health has been a very influential report. It tells a virtuous cycle story, that health promotes productivity, that productivity promotes growth, that growth promotes health, promotes productivity, promotes growth. It's very much a half story because it doesn't speak about the way in which health can be, in certain industries, in certain circumstances, health can be consumed the health of shipbuilders, the health of people in dangerous circumstances can be seen as being consumed rather than being an asset for productivity. Anyway, so the other thing, so this report, Investing in Health, it's, as I say, very sophisticated. It introduces a number of new technologies, in particular the DALY, the Disability Adjusted Life Year, and the dollar per DALY, the cost of an intervention which reduces the burden of disease. And the ultimate finding of this report was that structural adjustment can be compatible with health development if you do it in the way the World Bank suggests. This is essentially the stratified model of health system development being offered by the bank, which is that the rich shall be looked after by private providers and through private insurance. The middle may well be looked after through social insurance, which will support private providers, including non-profit providers, and the poor will be looked after through a safety net, a minimum safety net based on this idea of cost-effective interventions, and these services may well be provided entirely by the private sector, perhaps by non-voluntary, perhaps by public. But they'll be provided on a purchasing basis based on the package of approved benefits. Okay, 1995 sees the establishment of the WTO, which is of great significance in terms of the rest of our story, because of the agreements under the WTO which are of particular significance to health. And in the parallel associated presentation I make about trade, we discuss in particular the agreement on agriculture, the TRIPS agreement, the GATS agreement, and the subsequent move to free trade agreements with TRIPS plus provisions. But WTO, the establishment of the WTO is of great significance. It's also worth noting that from 95 to 98, the OECD initiated a proposed new agreement, the MAI, the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, which was an issue which had been rejected by the developing countries in the context of the WTO negotiations, the Uruguay round negotiations. The rich countries were continuing to push for the inclusion of investment protection through WTO, and this has sometimes been referred to as one of the Singapore issues, which were raised in the 1997 Ministerial Council meeting in Singapore. But when this failed, the OECD sought to achieve a parallel outside the WTO agreement, which was defeated by mass mobilization around the world. People saying that maintenant we do not, refusing to give the special privileges to investors. Well, of course, what we've seen since then through bilateral investment treaties and through the inclusion of investment in various trade agreements has been the continued advancement of this agenda. So WTO has been established. Then there's this parallel drive for an agreement on investment. In 1997, the South African parallel import legislation was passed. Now, parallel importing is a provision which is legitimate under TRIPS. Of course, the country has got to pass its own legislation to give effect to this possibility. But the TRIPS agreement makes it is clearly legal to parallel import. This means that you're importing drugs from, if the owner of the intellectual property is selling the drugs too expensively in your country, but they are being on the open market being sold in other countries at a cheaper rate, then you can legitimately go and buy them in the other country and bring them into your own country and use them there. And this was the legislation which was challenged by Big Pharma in 1997, but the challenge was defeated in April 2001. And I think it's very significant to note the role of Médecins Sans Frontières and what has now become KEI, Knowledge Ecology International, and massive demonstrations in the streets of South Africa under the banner of the Treatment Action Campaign, and also the solidarity of AIDS activists in the US who made things so uncomfortable for Al Gore, who was at that stage competing with George W. Bush for the presidential nomination, for the presidential vote, that the US, which had initially supported the drug companies, withdrew its support from the drug companies. So 2001 is a very significant year in this story, partly because it's the year of 9/11, partly because it's the year that the Treatment Action Campaign defeated the Big Pharma, but partly also because of the Doha Ministerial Council meeting of WTO, which adopted the trade and public health declaration, which we'll come to shortly. Meanwhile, the World Bank and the IMF have announced a new form of structural adjustment, which is called PRSPs, Poverty Reduction Strategy Papers. The big difference between the old SAPs and the new PRSPs is that the PRSPs have to be developed by the country themselves. But of course, in other words, they then have to be approved by the IMF, and if they don't carry the policy the policy principles that the IMF wants, and which were illustrated by the old SAPs, then they won't be approved. So whether PRSPs represent an advance or not is a moot point. 1999 is also the year of the Ministerial Council meeting in Seattle, and again it was a period when the developed countries the industrial rich countries were seeking to push ahead with the Singapore issues, including investment provisions. The processes were outrageous within the conference, with secret meetings and secret caucusing and quite significant bullying. But in the streets outside in Seattle, the dramatic protests were very well known. Seattle represents the beginning of the end in terms of the neoliberal project being advanced through the WTO, and what we are to see in the 2000s will be the explosion of free trade agreements. Okay, so then we have Gavi being launched, the Gavi Alliance, the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunisation, which is now just called the Gavi Alliance, which had strong support from the Gates Foundation, and represents the emergence of a new paradigm in global health policy, which is the paradigm of vertical disease-focused programs, and we'll make further point about this as we proceed into the next slide. December 2000 also sees the first People's Health Assembly and the development of a People's Health Charter, which signifies the beginning of the People's Health movement, but also signifies that there is a groundswell of opposition to the neoliberal project in health, just as there is to the neoliberal project in global economic management. Okay, so there we have this period of essentially the 80s and 90s, with the interplay of the World Banks in investing in health, the establishment of the WTO, the emergence of highly active retroviral agents from 1996 onwards, and therefore the increasing significance of the price of treatment of AIDS HIV treatments. I should have said earlier that in 1997, when the South African parallel import legislation was passed, the drug companies were selling an AIDS treatment at roughly $10,000 per year in South Africa. You can imagine how many people could afford that. While Cipla, the Indian generic manufacturer, was selling it to MSF for $350 a year. So it was clearly a responsible act of the South African government to seek much cheaper supplies of AIDS medications. Okay, so this slide only covers a 3-year period, but it's a absolutely critical period. April 2001 sees the defeat of Big Pharma in relation to the Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa. And as I've commented already, the role of the feet on the streets in South Africa, of solidarity between various forms of global social action, the technical support of MSF and KEI all contributed to this outcome. In the same month as Big Pharma was being finally defeated in South Africa, WHO had organised, with the World Bank and with Big Pharma, had organised a conference in Norway at which WHO accepted differential pricing, or what's now known as tiered pricing, as a solution to the problem of access to medicines. Of course, the problem with differential pricing, the differential pricing means that the drug companies agree, out of the kindness of their heart, to sell drugs at a cheaper price in poorer countries and a higher price in richer countries. The problem with this, of course, is leakage, that while you've got the legitimacy of parallel importing, there's nothing to stop countries purchasing drugs from a country where they're supplied more cheaply and taking them back into a country where the price has been set more highly. What the drug companies would say is that the problem is of the black market, but I think it is also about this particular flexibility which is embedded in the TRIPS agreement. However, the events which were to take place later in that year put differential pricing very much on the back burner. September 2001 is 9/11, and I think it's open to us collectively to ask what 9/11 signified. Just a group of Islamic extremists, or the possibility that there is a gradual loss of confidence in the promise of the Enlightenment, the promise of modernity, the promise of technology and democracy bringing happiness and growth to everybody. I think that the latter needs to be seriously considered. November 2001, just 2 months later, is the meeting of the Ministerial Council of WTO in Doha, at which time the trade ministers meeting there adopted the Doha Declaration on Public Health and Trade, which effectively said that trade provisions should not override the interests of public health. This was certainly a victory for treatment action advocates. The Doha meeting also put in place further negotiations to try and make compulsory licensing available to countries which didn't have their own generic manufacturing capacity. 1 month later, the Commission on Macroeconomics reported. Now, this is a commission set up by WHO to explore, and they were explicitly asked to explore the implications of health for macroeconomics. In other words, trying to build an argument which would persuade the finance ministers and the World Bank that health matters. Significantly, the Commission was not asked to report on the influence of macroeconomics on health. It was just health and macroeconomics. The report revisited a lot of the material which had been covered by the 1993 World Bank's report on investing in health. It repeated the virtuous cycle story that health contributes to productivity, contributes to growth, which contributes to health, which contributes to productivity and growth, which advocated a close to community model for delivering healthcare, but essentially repeated the focus on cost-effective interventions, which had been a feature of the World Bank's report in 1993. However, there are two major differences between the CMH report of 2001 and the 1993 World Bank report. Firstly, is the reliance on increasing aid. The CMH report is very firm that the health needs of the developing countries should be met in large part by increasing development assistance. And it is very likely that this report was influential in the escalation of development assistance for health, which we saw during the 2000s, the early 2000s. The other feature of this report was that whereas the 1993 World Bank report had focused only on productivity as an argument for investing in health, this report argues that social stability, that there's a quote from this report to the effect that globalisation is on trial, and unless there is a dramatic increase in aid, development assistance for health, the continued stability of the model of globalisation, which is characterised by the Washington Consensus, is under threat. So the CMH report is very significant in terms of its effect, but also in terms of what it signifies about the thinking within the sort of global governance circles at this time. So the Global Fund starts work in 2002 with significant support from the Gates Foundation. October 2002 is the Bristol-Myers Squibb is defeated in the DDI case against Thailand. The significance of this is just to say that the Thais have been continued under attack for roughly 30 years for trying to deliver cheap medicines on a universal basis, and this was yet another example of it. March 2003 is the invasion of Iraq. And the significance of this has only become more clear in the succeeding 12 years to 2014-15, which is the limits to US power, the limits to US unilateralism. And the questions that I raised about the significance of 9/11 essentially remain. Okay, which brings us to I think this is the last of these red and green slides, to the period 2003 to 2013. The Thais are continuing under pressure with October 2003, the opening of negotiations for a US-Thai free trade agreement. And again, the sort of things which are at risk include compulsory licensing, the full use of TRIPS flexibilities, and so on. November 2003 is the Cancun meeting of the WTO Ministerial Council, and this is quite significant because the developing countries, in particular led by the group of 21 plus China, were quite resistant to the continuing pressure to extend the regulatory provisions of the WTO agreements, in particular the Singapore issues, which included investment protection and the deadlock over agriculture. This deadlock over agriculture needs to be understood. It's quite a critical part of what's going on. The rich countries are asking the developing countries, particularly the emerging economies, so-called the BRICS economies, to reduce their tariff barriers to manufactured imports. The corporations are seeing hundreds of millions of middle-class people in China and in India, and they want to sell more of their stuff to those middle classes, and I guess the middle class would like to buy it. The countries themselves are saying, well, we're not absolutely sure about reducing our tariffs against manufactured imports until the US, Japan, and Europe make their agricultural protection, reduce their agricultural protection. In particular, the tariff protection of Japan and Europe, and the huge subsidies being paid to support exporters by the US. So the deadlock is between so-called market access, meaning the access of the corporates to the developing country markets for manufactured goods, and agricultural protection in the rich world, is essentially the biggest single issue which has led to the deadlock in the WTO. And with that deadlock comes a very strong move, in particular from the US, to focus on bilateral and regional free trade agreements outside the WTO. November 2003 sees the Free Trade of the Americas agreement actually not successful, and because of resistance in Latin America. July 2004 sees the development. This is another feature of the Doha round, which is that it was described as a development round, and the framework for Doha as a development round is adopted in 2004. In fact, of course, the claims of the developing countries in the context of the Doha so-called development round have not been effectively addressed. The 2005 is quite significant in terms of this movement towards free trade agreements, because it's the beginning of the Trans-Pacific Strategic Economic Partnership, which eventually became the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement from in 2008. Now, this agreement has not yet been finalised, but it is a major agreement among, as of now, among 12 countries around the Pacific Rim, led by the US, and advancing a number of WTO plus provisions, particularly including, well, we don't know because it's been done in secret, but we believe it will include investor-state dispute settlement. In other words, the investors have a right to challenge country policy making. We'll come back to this issue in a later presentation. It includes, the TPP includes provisions designed which would have the effect of increasing the price of medicines. There are provisions which are seeking, from the US, seeking to ban the use of cost effectiveness criteria in pricing medicines, and so forth. But we'll come back to that. 2005 is the Hong Kong Ministerial. 2007 is the formation of the International Health Partnership Plus, IHP Plus. Now, the significance of IHP Plus in this story is that it's a significant landmark in a return to concern regarding health systems. I described earlier how, driven in part by the WHO Commission on Macroeconomics and Health, the early 2000s saw a dramatic increase in development assistance for health, and most of that was being distributed through vertical disease-centred programs. By the middle part of this decade, it was clear that these vertical disease-centred programs, whilst they were enhancing access to vaccines, enhancing access to AIDS/HIV treatments, were also fragmenting health systems. And the paradox is that is that AIDS HIV treatment, malaria treatment, require coherent health systems as well as access to medicines and spray and access to insecticide treated bed nets. So the effectiveness of these vertical disease focused treatments was being increasingly limited by the destructive impact they were having on health systems, including increasing administrative burden on health ministries, the fragmentation of health system delivery, internal brain drain, and other features. 2008 sees the subprime mortgage crisis break, which obviously led to a serious increase in poverty around the globe, both in the rich and the poor countries, serious limitations on the ability of developing countries to actually achieve economic development, and led in due course to the European sovereign debt crisis in 2011. In an associated presentation in this series, I'll talk in more detail about the subprime mortgage crisis and the sovereign debt crisis, but it is important to understand the dynamics through which these two crises have broken. 2008, of course, sees the report of the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health, although the Latin Americans would have preferred it to be called the Commission on the Social Determination of Health, making the point that it's not an accident that the massive inequalities in health have been produced. They are being produced by the agency of human bodies. But of course, it is a bit of a paradox that the optimism of a Commission on Social Determinants takes place at the same time as the most significant economic crisis since the 1930s is making action on the social determinants both more difficult and more important. 2008 sees the World Health Report on primary health care, which is another feature in the return to a focus on health systems. And 2010 sees the World Health Report on universal health cover. Now, this idea of universal health cover we'll come to again in the presentation I'm doing on health systems, but it has a certain echo with the WHO report on macroeconomics and health in terms of WHO trying to get some drive from the sitting in the slipstream of the World Bank. The call for universal health cover has been deliberately ambiguous as to whether that universal health cover is to be achieved through a health insurance system or a single payer or a marketized health insurance system, whether it is to be achieved through a pluralistic public-private service delivery system or a public system or an entirely privatized system. The WHO has been keen to leave the slogan of universal health cover somewhat open in order to continue to gain the support of other powerful bodies. As I say, 2011 saw the European sovereign debt crisis, and we'll come back to that, and 2012 saw the beginning of the TISA negotiations. Now, the TISA negotiations, this stands for the Trade in Services Agreement, represents a further forum shift outside the WTO. In this time around the issues covered by the GATS agreement. So the GATS agreement within the WTO is the agreement on trade in services, but this has also come to a deadlock for the reasons I've explained earlier. And with the GATS agreement renegotiations deadlocked, the rich countries have resolved to produce a new agreement which will be undertaken initially between consenting parties, and then other countries would be forced to join without having participated in the negotiations. And much the same thing holds for the TTIP negotiations, which also commenced in 2013. TTIP stands for the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is essentially between Europe and the US, and which will cover many of the same issues as are being covered in the TPP, which I described a little bit earlier. Okay, so let's leave the green and red slides here. This slide, I think, the big features of the period covered by this slide is the subprime mortgage crisis and the move away from, well, the increasing criticism of vertical disease centred projects as the basis for development assistance, and because of the damage that does to health systems and therefore the limits that it imposes on actually doing anything useful about health. And of course the movement to free trade outside WTO. So how do we make sense of all this? Well, in the associated presentation that I've presented on macroeconomics and health, I've elaborated on the idea that from the Second World War to around the 1970s, it was the long boom. But since the 1970s, since then, the global economy, particularly as it affects the older developed countries, the rich world, has been slowed. And that one way of understanding this slowing is this idea of post-Fordist slowdown, post-Fordist crisis of overproduction, over-accumulation. I don't need to go into this in much detail here because it's elaborated in the other presentation. But on this slide, I've developed the idea that the need to manage this post-Fordist dynamic has been one of the driving policy imperatives which has shaped global health governance during the period that we've been discussing. And on this slide, I've listed 4 mechanisms whereby the policy imperative has shaped health. The first of these is free trade. And this has been very significant in terms of, as I've described, the deadlock at the WTO, but the way in which free trade has been pushing to open up new markets for transnational corporations in the emerging economies. But the more those new markets are opened up, the more difficult it is for local indigenous producers to develop. Like at the same time, the subsidies of, in particular, US agriculture and the dumping of subsidized agricultural goods has had a big impact on the livelihood of small farmers in countries like India, in many of the countries of Africa, where cheaper goods can be deposited at the shipping terminals rather than being brought in by local producers. The second dash point under free trade, this idea of ISDS, is a very important part of the story we're telling. ISDS stands for Investor-State Dispute Settlement, which gives, under free trade agreements, gives corporations the right to challenge regulatory policies of the governments of which are hosting their foreign investment. And the significance of this has been elaborated very strongly in relation to Australia's plain packaging legislation, which has been challenged under this ISDS provision or investor protection provision. And if that challenge is sustained, or even if it isn't, the provision of investor protection in free trade agreements with investor-state dispute settlement is likely to be a very powerful deterrent to regulating in the public interest, in the interest of public health. So if governments can't do it for tobacco, they certainly won't be able to do it for food and alcohol. The third dash point is about the stronger enforcement of easier intellectual property in order to protect the profits of the knowledge-intensive transnational corporations, which in relation to the health system is very much about the pharmaceutical companies. So stronger enforcement of easier IP will mean higher priced medicines. The second major dot point on this slide is about unfair trade and the way in which unfair trade is needed to maintain the profits of northern-based transnational corporations, but does so at the cost of brain drain, does so at the cost of barriers to exporting products. So this idea of escalating tariffs is commonly illustrated in relation to Ghanaian chocolate. The more Ghanaian cocoa is processed into chocolate, the higher the tariffs are protecting the European market. So Ghanaian cocoa can be imported into Europe at a very low tariff. Ghanaian chocolate faces a very high tariff, escalating tariffs. The dumping of agricultural products I've referred to. Transfer pricing is a way in which corporations can avoid tax, and so this is part of the massive outflow of resources from the south to the north, which greatly exceeds the inflow via development assistance transfers. The third dot point here is about fiscal discipline, which is about the macroeconomic disciplines which are applied to borrowers but not to lenders. It is a dramatic asymmetry that irresponsible borrowing is punished with very tight discipline, which forces the borrowers to repay their debts. Irresponsible lending is in fact encouraged because the banks know that if they're too big to fail, they will be bailed out. So the role of the IMF is to keep indebted countries integrated within the global regime, to force them to pay their debts, but at the same time effectively preserving the right of the big lenders to undertake irresponsible, if not criminal, trickery in their lending. Okay, the fourth dot point here is about development assistance for health. In what way is this about managing the post-Fordist dynamic? Well, it's about addressing the most embarrassing health needs, which are being reproduced by the existing global regime, and shoring up the legitimacy of the prevailing regime. Now, this is one story. It's a story which I find persuasive, but I ask you to engage with the story, not necessarily to take it on board if it doesn't seem persuasive to you. But I think that these relationships are worth further study, whichever way you take them. Okay, so are there alternatives to the Washington consensus or the neoliberal ascendancy? On this slide I've listed 6 policies or broad policy strategies which I think respond to the inequitable and unsustainable features of the existing regime. The first of these is to restore the sovereignty of the nation state. And this is a reference to the growing power of transnational corporations and transnational banks vis-a-vis the nation state. So what I would be calling for here is for international agreement around the regulation of transnational corporations and banks with a view to reducing their ability to bully nation states, to bribe nation states, to auction off their investment capacity to nation states, but to regulate them in a more to restore the sovereignty of the nation state. And the organisation Corporate Accountability International has been is a good reference to follow up on this argument, and there has been some there is circulating proposals for regulation of the transnationals. My second policy strategy is to move towards greater democracy in global governance, away from big power hegemony. I think this is already happening with the formation of the BRICS, which is a bit of a heterogeneous group of countries, but Latin America through UNASUR and the BRICS group and the G77 group are all promise the possibility of greater democracy in global governance decision making. The ability of great powers, so-called, to impose their will or perhaps the interests of their transnational corporations on other countries is a major problem in the present regime. My third alternative policy strategy is to protect local production, local supply and local services. This is the Chinese path. It is in essence a continuation of the dynamic which characterized the long boom. It is about recycling wages, mass employment, wages recycled as mass purchasing, mass consumption, which supports mass production, which supports wages. And this is not consistent with having one transnational corporation provide global production for the whole world for particular products or services. This does not mean that every country shall be an island to itself, but it is an issue of relativeness, that countries will be given space to protect local production, local supply, local services. The fourth point on this list is to forge new alliances between progressive forces in the north and in the global south. And this is part of moving towards greater democracy and global governance, away from the domination of big powers and transnational corporations. Fifthly is domestic security. Now, what do I mean here? Domestic security as a condition for generosity. The treatment of refugees in Australia, in Texas, in Belgium, and in other countries has been lacking in generosity, particularly having regard to the role of Europe and Australia and the US in reproducing the global inequalities and the global conflict, which often drives desperate people to seek refuge. But without security, it is very difficult to persuade for the population of those countries to find that generosity. And I'm meaning here the economic insecurity. I'm referring here to the economic insecurity, the cultural insecurity, which is driven by the neoliberal economic policies. If people don't have secure retirement income, don't have security in terms of whether knowing they'll be able to afford their children's education, don't have security about health care, don't have security about their housing, then they are more and more likely to be xenophobic. And it's the environment, the cultural and economic environment within the rich world which stokes the lack of generosity, in my view. So the importance in this argument for domestic security in the rich countries, as well as, and that doesn't mean rich, doesn't mean wealth, it means security. Okay, and finally, communication and personal contact as conditions for solidarity. If you are arguing for building stronger solidarity between the countries of the third world, between progressive forces in the rich world and progressive forces in the south. We need to think about how the kind of person-to-person communication, the kind of personal contact can be built so that people can have a more open understanding of difference, can achieve fulfillment through working across difference. So there's 6 policy directions which arise from the analysis that I've presented so far. Finally, I think this is finally, let's get back to the idea of democratizing global health governance. And on this slide, I've listed 6. I've listed the 6 pillars that I introduced earlier, and under each of the pillars, I'm now raising some directions which I think flow from the analysis that I've presented. In relation to formal regulatory structures, I'm arguing to strengthen WHO, to strengthen the UN High Commission on Human Rights. I'm arguing to resist the pressure for WTO plus treaties, to look for new treaties, for example, treaties on the on professional migration, to mitigate the problems of brain drain, treaties on the regulation of transnational corporations and banks. There's a lot of scope for international multilateral treaties of that kind. In relation to the second pillar, I've argued for the strengthening of the countervailing blocks, such as the BRICS, such as the G77, to promote a more equal distribution of decision rights. In relation to the transnational corporations, I'm arguing to monitor, regulate and require accountability. I'm arguing that the kind of IP laws which have been introduced by India make sense and should be more widely adopted. And I'm arguing that we should be refusing extreme investor protection provisions which are being driven by the TNCs. Under my 4th pillar, the disciplines of the marketplace, I'm arguing for global agreement to regulate the market players. For example, global agreement on capital controls, which has been a big demand by the transnationals, even though even the IMF has in recent years agreed that there is a role for capital control. I'm arguing for trade agreements which protect space for local production and local supply. In terms of classes, constituencies, social movements, I'm arguing for a focus on solidarity among those who have got most to gain from a more equitable, more sustainable dispensation. And finally, under ideas, information, knowledges and ideologies, I'm arguing that we need to challenge neoliberal healthcare models, and we need to promote comprehensive primary healthcare and a social determinants model of health. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. I'm sorry it's gone on so long, but I hope it's been useful, and since it's a recording, perhaps you can watch it several times. What about our discussion starters? So do you feel comfortable about working through the difference between governance and government? Do you agree with the 6 pillars of global governance? Would you add other pillars? Would you argue for a different way of seeing things? What do you think about the 3 different usages of globalization that I've introduced? The 3 different usages and their implications for global health. Could you explain and discuss the significance of some of the issues that I've touched upon during this presentation? Bandung, NIEO, Alma-Ata, debt crisis, too big to fail, etc. I've argued that since the 1970s, global health governance has been shaped by the need to manage the threat of post-Fordist economic crisis. Do you agree? Could you comment? Can you make sense of that argument? And finally, what can you do to help to democratize global health governance? It's a good question for all of us. Thanks very much for listening.